JeffChanners, how's it going today? I'm going to be sharing with you an interesting video from Stuart from Technical Intuition. He is a remote viewer and he actually shares more insight as to why human beings are here on the planet. Now, the truth may be more terrifying than any fiction that you've actually read. Dive into this with me and comment below. Let me know your thoughts and we'll go from there.
In this video, I'm going to talk about the concept of moksha. This is a Sanskrit word which literally means the freedom or liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. I'm going to go into the remote viewing data that was obtained when 4 different viewers looked at this topic blind. And the amount of corroborating data between the spread of work was very, very high. And then some of the new information that came in through the remote viewing data that caught all of us after we had completed this project and we did analysis and we saw what the actual target was. There's some very startling information that came out across the board on all the works. Where remote viewers come in is we took this project. I was one of the remote viewers who worked the project blind. There were 3 other remote viewers who also did the same. And by blind, all I really simply mean is that when I ran the actual project, I did not know what the target was. So there's a project manager who sends out to the different viewers just a randomly generated number. And then when we sit down to do the remote viewing work, our unconscious mind has no problem tracing that number back to the associated project, which is moksha. So it's a way that allows me as a viewer and any other viewer when operating blind to, since I don't know what it is I'm remote viewing, all my biases or information that I might have read about or books about the topic, it keeps it all out because I have no idea what I could be remote viewing. So it's a way of kind of taking a step back and keeping the data a little bit more clean. It's one of the fairly standard remote viewing protocols is that you really want to run projects blind whenever you can. To kind of secure the integrity of the information. It also makes it all the more fascinating when very, very specific information relevant to the topic comes out of the work, because the viewers had no idea what they were remote viewing. But when the viewers get back this concept of reincarnation in their work directly in a blind session, well, you know that you're on topic and you're on target. I'm going to go a bit over the information. I'm going to start from the top. I'm going to start from describing what the viewers, this is referred to as a group summary. So I'm taking the work that is agreed upon across the session work for the most part, and then describing first the site was the first information that we get when describing moksha. And then there's a lot of context that came in through this project. And it's once I start getting into the information, it all makes sense because it's a very complex issue. It's not something simply straightforward, which is what the religious beliefs have, I suppose, perpetuated in the past. I think if this information wasn't attained by remote viewing by me personally, done blind, done in a very rigorous manner using a structured remote viewing technique, if multiple viewers hadn't come up with the same information describing the same mechanics, the same groups that are responsible, it would probably be even difficult for me to believe in. So to begin with, I'm going to start with a description of the site, which is essentially what is surrounding the target before we jump down into specifics and then also the contextual data that answers a number of different questions about moksha. When we originally described this site, it's a fence or a grid around a place. This acts as a barrier. It collects and traps people, things, or objects. This is actually an innocent planet that is being used in an unintended way. And this meters the flow and acts as a checkpoint and an access point for an external force. One viewer described it as similar to hocus pocus in a way of its energetics that the viewer wasn't familiar with. And it's occurring on a crowded planet. It's a deliberate function that acts as a cage. People have been dispersed here, and a form of perverted injustice is occurring. A third viewer described it as a large naturally formed object like a planet that acts as an animal pen. This is a refugee camp tucked away out of sight, and a magnetic force. It stirs, agitates, and it works in a cylindrical manner, like clockwork over a long expanse of time. In my session, my work described a planetary system that's extremely crowded and jammed. Ghostly voices are flooding into this place, and it's incredibly harrowing for them. It's a bone-chilling experience. As a viewer, when I remote viewed this, I had descriptions that it made me upset in the session. It elicited contempt for what was going on at the site. But the activity at the site was this concept of a net that's been spun, and it's an operation of catch and release on a grand scale. So there's a massive grid that exists around this planet, and it acts as a checkpoint, a waypoint or rest stop where souls are drained, and then that in turn energizes something else. So very, very specific information about souls, about the clockwork nature over a long expanse of time, as well as this collecting, trapping, and then re-releasing. All this information came in. Okay, what's going on locally here? And the fact that it's the entire planet. The process works is that Earth is shielded by a companion object. And we're not sure if this is a physical thing. I mean, we're dealing with a type, if this is a technology, it's a type of technology that's so far beyond what humans can even probably comprehend. It may as well be magic. I mean, it makes sense why one viewer probably uses this word, hocus pocus. It's so far beyond his own lexicon that it may as well be magic. So whether this is a physical object or not, we're really not entirely certain. It would make sense that it's not physical, but you can make a couple of different, I suppose, educated guesses. Maybe it exists in a phased state, a different dimension, where this object is, this companion object that creates this net. We're really not quite sure, but it's most likely because we don't have the vocabulary or the comprehension to even understand how it exists in this state. But so we're going to use words that we can understand, the mechanical aspect of it, the energetic aspect of it, the acting like a net, things like that. First viewer said it's a companion object to Earth. It's something that's powerful and magnetic, and it squeezes tightly around the globe. Another viewer describes it as a magnetic vice that is attached around a large place. It's a mechanical process that incorporates destructive chemicals, and an individual undergoes bombardment as they pass through this system. And the people that pass through, they feel lost. They don't have an understanding of what's going on, kind of associated with the losing of memories would make sense. But they have this desire that seems to remain consistent through them, even though through this feeling of lost. More work describes that it's a little bit more specific. It actually gets the information point that these are souls that are being bent back towards the planet, and that the information, that the closest analogy was kind of like gravitational lensing, where if your soul is light, instead of kind of shooting off after you die off the planet, off to somewhere else in the universe, what's occurring is there's a artificial structure that is lensing or curving your light back down to Earth again. And then every time this occurs, it's constantly lensed or pulled back. It shows that this is an activity, is powering a massive rotating object that visually appears like an axle in space. It's fluctuating and absorbing energy that's created by this lensing effect. So the act of actually creating the lensing, of sending the light soul back to Earth, generates energy inside of this large structure. And it seems to be, there's chemicals that seem to be involved, at least that's our vocabulary to describe what's going on. Something's being bombarded. There's a destructive process, which I'll get into a little bit further in the work. But there's actually a fracturing that occurs to force this light, this soul, to kind of come back down to the planet again for a second, third, infinite amount of times. But ultimately, that's powering something else. So the second contextual part of the information that is described is, well, what is being done to the reincarnating souls? There's a fracturing that is occurring. So the mind, the remote viewing data specifically stated that the mind and body of a person is splayed and fractured. It's rendering them very confused and upset about their predicament. Something is being extracted and taken from them without them being conscientious of the occurrence. The analogy that was used in the work is that of bees in a box, or like a harvest of honey from bees, and that there's a honeycombing. This is kind of the trapping within the mesh that's occurring, that's going on. And then there's a third party that comes in, extracts honey out of this box, this bee box, takes it for some other purpose, and then puts the bees back into the box. And then that's a very close analogy that matches what is going on here with souls. Another viewer described it as harvesting. There's a harvest that occurs when a soul goes up and then is refracted back down. More of the remote viewing work describes that there is the whole circumstance itself is referred to as toxic. The number of souls, the amount of individuals that are reincarnating on this wheel, is that creates an instability that is required for this alchemical process. Is that without this volatile planet, without volatile souls, without creating this certain type of scenario where someone's taken and thrown back and you have no memory, it wouldn't produce what is desired by this third party. The crowded state of Earth and the number of souls here is required to create an optimal environment to extract what's desired. The confusion and anger caused by the confinement feeds into this process. And an aspect of the individual's mind or their soul, the intelligence itself, again, it's using our language, may not be literal, it may be more metaphorical, but is that the intelligence or the mind of the soul is being fed on by an external parasitic force. And the drawings of this in the remote viewing work that were not particularly pleasant. They're slightly grotesque. And when the descriptions of this type of thing that was doing this process, it was that were used to associate as it was something that's warped, sadistic, and twisted. That's actually doing this process. The third contextual information that was reached through this project is it answered, how did this come about? And how did this scenario even begin in the first place? How was it allowed? You think of if, say there are forces that are beyond the planet that have the ability to affect what's going on here. How could they have let this happen? How unjust is the universe, or is it all just unjust? And the information was in the remote viewing data that hinted at and described what actually occurred that allowed this to manifest. What is described is that historically in the past, is that the planet was viewed with extreme envy by an external force, and that there existed a time here where reincarnation did not exist, where there was life here, but when these individuals or when life forms died here, they weren't trapped here. They were able to leave. But the planet itself was viewed with a significant amount of envy by this outside force. And what occurred, we simply describe as a massive war. There were massive explosions. There was a huge force that was met with resistance in this particular place in the universe, and the fate of a planet was decided. Ideas of destiny, a massive war that occurred place, battle scars on the surface of the earth, things like that. But ultimately, it came to a conclusion. The period of time or the expanse of time we're really uncertain of as far as what the remote viewing data is saying. But ultimately, at the end, an armistice resolution was reached. And then there was an agreement made that both opposing sides, for a period of time at least, that there would be a truce. However, those that wanted to protect this planet, to prevent the group that looked at this place with envy, lost. They were unable to prevent the outside force. And there was a sense of something was given up. And what was given up was, part of what was given up in this massive war was Earth. And so this is why we think that it was a much larger conflict that just had to do with this even solar system. And there was a treaty that was signed, and it was like, okay, well, we'll give you this, but you can't touch any of this other stuff over here. And there's an agreement. Part of that agreement, part of that signage, if you will, on that treaty was they signed over their protection or whatever it was, that their right to keep Earth the way it had been previously to the way we know it now. They signed it over to, okay, you can take Earth to this outside party that looked upon it with envy. But ultimately, the reason it came about was conquest. Is that there was conquest by an external third party that came in through domination, brought about what exists here today. The fourth piece of contextual information that the project of Moksha was able to describe was, how does one achieve Moksha? And while this specific aspect was not something we went too deep into, even though, Moksha is the liberation from this. A lot of because of the way that a topical remote viewing search is set up is it tries to get as much information or surrounding the idea. And so we could have just completely focused directly on, okay, well, how does one achieve Moksha? But we got a lot more information than just that. But the information we did get, it shows a couple of different things. First of all, it shows that upon death, that the particles, we're using our vocabulary that the viewers have, whether it's actually this, it may be something else, it's the closest in the vocabulary that we can use to describe it, is that particles like cosmic dust or dark matter, something strange, a strange type of particle that we don't have a description for, becomes charged and creates an emission. It's launched out of the individual very, very quickly, like a cannonball out of a cannon, or a bullet out of a gun. and that this occurs from the center of the individual's being, the central nervous. So it comes out of the central nervous system. In other remote viewing data, you actually can see this, is that if you do an event recreation or remote viewing and you do the exact moment of death, and across the board in almost all of those remote viewing sessions, you see a spiral, something is spiraling right out of the top of the head of the individual from their internal system. And when you look at that, a massive amount of energy is being expulsed. And what's being described in this session is that is essentially what the soul is. That is the release of the intelligence of the mind from the body, from the physical. And it's being sent to a place that is described as a tangled mess or a superhighway for the soul. But as the previous contextual information was showing, is that there is a mechanical object around Earth that prevents the soul from reaching this highway. Seems like if you're able to reach the superhighway, you can go pretty much anywhere you want. Achieving moksha gives you access to this superhighway, and where those lead, your guess is as good as anyone else's, I suppose, at this point. But for this to work properly, to actually achieve moksha, is that the position and the angle with which you exit your body is very, very important. And the concept in the work is that it brought up the idea of how the Egyptians used to evoke an out-of-body experience, and how the angle with which the body was actually even laying was considered important to the Egyptians. And in the remote viewing work, it described that this 45-degree angle was a key element. And so it's as the body dies, the soul needs to exit at a correct angle, lest it be trapped within the system again, and then is refracted back and then lensed back again into another body. Second piece of information that was obtained on how one achieves moksha is that it shows it as a blissful moment, but that an unseen actor unfolds something like a safety rope here. And there's a mechanism, or the device that has held this group of people hostage in a cell is, again, it's describing this broken record where they've skipped again and again and again, is that there's something like a safety rope that if you exit at a right angle, is that there's a group waiting for you to help you the rest of the way out. I would assume, at least we would assume, that it's probably the group that used to be in charge of this particular space, or in charge of this environment around Earth as far as death is concerned, but then had to give it up for what they deemed a greater good during the treaty or the armistice. And so, but they're there that if you can meet them at a certain point, they can help you out the rest of the way. The energetics leaving the body, though, is that there's a great deal of fear that's associated with this. Again, because of the reincarnation process, because you don't have any of the memory that's associated with what's going on. It's all seemingly brand new to you. And so the fear of this seems to be something that prevents most people from ever getting that. And instead, they get trapped up into the system or the device that there'll be more work. I'm laterally thinking here, but I don't want to get too off topic. Another YouTube video, which I'm going to discuss, is the most significant remote viewing target. And it's going to talk a little bit about this because it's very, very important. And it has to do with not going into the light when you die. But I'm not going to go too far down that road. But it seems that because of the fear from when you die, that and needing to exit at a certain angle to find that kind of safety rope where someone's there waiting for you to help you get the rest of the way out, prevents most people from actually reaching it. The end of this procedure is something, the way we describe it is, it's like you've had a vice on your head for a very, very long period of time. And this vice has gone all the way down into your brain, into your mind. There's cords and cables. You didn't even realize that was occurring. That's created this environment for you to repeat these lives over and over again. And that the freedom from moksha is this device is being ripped off and taken off the top of your head. And so, you know, the closest analogy to something like that is you could look at the movie The Matrix when Neo wakes up and all the cords are pulled out of his back. That's what we describe when you obtain moksha. That's, in this essence, in the human vocabulary, what is occurring. And the drawing is something in your head is being ripped off and is being pulled off violently. That's kept you here in the first place. Ultimately, though, it just seems the key aspects is the angle with which you exit the body is very important. Finding the rope of those who help you out the rest of the way seems to be important. But then also the fear of the entire situation seems to be kind of a condemning factor, that because of that fear, because of that unknown, souls tend to go into a place that leads them back here in another life, which is something I'll talk about in a future video that we kind of got more information on a different remote viewing project. So the next bit of contextual information that we were able to obtain with the project is it was to answer why was the system created in the first place. And this remote viewing data points to the system on Earth and that it's just one tiny component in a much larger system. It's minuscule. It's a much, much larger operation. And it describes that we are part of a funnel, and it's a slough or a state of moral degradation or spiritual dejection in a manner, and that the system encircles us and that its proponents have cast a wide net, not just here on this planet. And the advocates, or the torchbearers of this system, they, whether or not it's exactly these things, against the viewer's vocabulary, I really have to stress this. So it's like this, but those who advocate and perpetuate this system, the closest vocabulary in the viewer's own words is that these things are like demons. And so they're not real wonderful things. Again, the previous work of like, well, what's feeding on the intelligence during this extraction process that then fractures the individual, the soul, and then sends them back. It's something parasitic, something that's twisted and warped. But the work describes that they have put man in this cage, the mind in this cage, and that wars of men, anarchy, destruction, societal overthrows, cyclical revolutions that occur down here all fuel the system that actually keeps us entrapped. And so the unstable, this goes back to and reinforces the idea of the alchemical process of this all, of the stew that's created down here, the uncertainty, the mayhem, because there's just far too many people here on this planet, is that's intended because it creates the chaos that feeds into the system that powers it. And so when pinpointing in remote viewing work, the energetic activity that's occurring when a soul dies, it gets caught up in the system and then is sent back, it appears that a part of them is chipped off and then carried off somewhere else. And so it's extracted. Again, this is the honey that's then taken from the bees. And when you view this space, you get a couple, first you get the sound and you get voices, and it's just, there's many, many voices that are kind of caught in this system, and it's a drowning out sound. It's all incoherent talk. That's when you're describing this. It's a limbo state that's occurring. And these aspects that are chipped off are described as ghosts. So chipped off of the soul, they're described as ghosts, and they're shells of what they used to be. These are aspects of the soul that have been drained up and used, and an overwhelming melancholy and sadness is associated with these remnants. This is what's split apart and fractured off when the soul becomes enslaved. They're bundled up like a collection of twigs, and they're used as kindling. The viewer described it as just a massive amount of injustice. The purpose, why the system was created, is that it acts as what's being chipped off every time someone reincarnates, what's being taken, is being used as kindling. It's a type of fuel that feeds a different system that doesn't have anything to do with here. So we're in a way part of an engine, of one tiny piece, or one engine that feeds back into a power plant. So the purpose of the system is kind of analogous to, we're on a railway system, and that railway system, which is a railway of conquest, outer expansion, requires energy. It requires oil or grease to pad the railway, to continue the constant outer expansion, and that without this energy would be unable to do so. And so it needs oil to burn to travel across these large, massive expanses. But it's more than that too, because it's not just the traveling that requires the energy input, or even the conquest, but it's also what is creating a space or an environment for those that are in charge of this operation to pop in and out anywhere they want along this line, along this chain. And so ultimately, though, all these roads, if you will, lead back to Rome. There's like a central one that exists in that this energy is then powering this massive system. The final bit of contextual information that was collected with this remote viewing project was who's responsible. Some of the information kind of came out previously about the torchbearers, about the parasitic type of things that seem to be running it here, at least. But what agency is responsible for this? Who are the proponents of this conquest? We describe it as like a World War II supply line. who's the one leading the forces. And we are able to describe these individuals, where they are, and why they're essentially doing this. So I'm sure there's way more reasons than we were able to pick up or even possibly even comprehend. But simplistically, we were able to describe who these were, where they were, and the general purpose. Those that are perpetuating this system is run by what we describe as a council of organic entities. And they exist and operate this from a location that is incredibly concentrated. The gravity exists in such a way, and matter exists in a state that freezes time. So you can think of it kind of as a bubble or a void zone or a black hole that they're existing within. And they're creating an artificial environment, an artificial timeless environment from which to exist in, and then spread their influence out in a time reality in the universe. So essentially it's making them immortal. But they're doing this in a way that they spread throughout the universe through these various gateways. And so they create these little void zones in various pockets in space, in the universe. There's one here in this specific solar system. And this pocket is what allows them to pop in and out anywhere they want along this conquest or along this supply line. They create these pockets, but they also live within them. And so it's almost like they've entered into a different dimension that doesn't have time, but they can come out anywhere they want along the supply line for it. Now, the council themselves, the words we use to describe them because of the system, because they may as well be mortal, because they don't age, is that they've created a system for them within physical reality that has set themselves up as gods, lowercase g, gods. And they view themselves as such as well, compared to all the other life forms, even over the souls. They view themselves as the gods of reality, and that is what gives them the authority to do what they do, to increase expansion, that they have some sort of right to perpetuate their authority throughout the universe. The energy that is being funneled back to create the system is also being funneled back to them. And when we describe these beings, when we describe their nature, it's not very positive. We describe them as, simply put, evil, as that these things are very service to self. It's about their own conquest. It's about taking the energy that exists in the universe, accumulating it, and then absorbing it for their own desires and to serve their own purposes. It has nothing to do with serving a greater good. It has nothing to do with bringing harmony or peace to the universe. It has to do with conquest, war, and taking the spoils back to create a larger system of control, and they act as immortal gods to the system. Now, one final thing about when you remote view these specific entities is, and remember that these are organic life forms. So these were flesh and blood, just like you and I, but through their technology, whatever you want to call it, they created an environment for themselves that they are no longer biological. They may as well not be, because they exist in this timeless reality. With or without bodies, we're not sure. When we draw them, we describe them with eyes that are blazing white. When you remote view them, they do notice you actually looking at them, but it's rather irrelevant to them. In the session that I ran when it looked at these things, I was describing kind of the nature of this being. What can happen in remote viewing occasionally is you start in real time as you're remote viewing, describing the life form, noticing you. And so you're writing down information patterns of this thing, describing you, describing it. It's very, very strange. And so what happens when you look at these things with remote viewing, if that happens, is, well, at least for me, what occurred, it was like a gorilla noticing a gnat. It was very dismissive. It was like, little mind, I don't have time for this. Why would I even consider this little mind? I have much more important things, much more grand things to think about. And so it wasn't even really an interaction. It was just like a gorilla noticing a gnat and then ignoring it afterwards. And so it simply shows, either whether it's the level of ego or whether it's the level of, the truth to the situation, that these things operate in a place and on a plane of consciousness that so far surpasses where we are as humans on this physical plane. That's not even worth the time. Even think about us looking at them. That's not even a concern. But these are things that they used to be physical, they used to be organic beings, but through technology, through consciousness technology, they figured out a way to set themselves up to live forever, and so they don't die. And from that space, they have an outward expansion of conquest in the universe to perpetuate a system of control, to perpetuate a system of cages around planets that keep souls locked and trapped there, so that every time they die, they have to go back. And then there's a cutting off or fracturing off of that soul that then is collected into like a bundle of twigs to feed the system, to power the operation. And so we're essentially, souls are being used as kindling, is being used as coal for this system. And that while there may be other reasons that the soul may decide to jump into this system, like maybe even willingly put themselves in this situation, it's not the soul on this planet is not one that doesn't come without extreme dangers, because it seems that every time you die, there's a part of you that's lost and is fractured. And so reaching moksha is a very significant and important thing. Maybe the soul originally, I'm just speculating here at this point, your soul or my soul, we came here to learn something. But if you're stuck here for too long, is that you become so fractured that the ultimate end of that is something that's like a ghost. It's something that's used up. It's something that has lost its energetic potential. And so based off of some other work, which I'll be sharing in the future, I believe it's very important for people in their lifetime to be thinking about this type of thing, to be thinking about how do they attain moksha? How do they attain, first, is it in their highest good to do so right now is a very important aspect. Being able to have a dialogue with your higher self is very important to, is this the life where, attaining moksha or pursuing it is important. But I think that knowing that there is an outside group that, while they may not be in charge of this particular space, is there and waiting for people that figure out how to exit the body at the right angle, figure out how to avoid the specific snares that exist for souls as they exit the body. This will be a topic for another remote viewing video on YouTube, which I'll talk about. That there are those outside waiting, and they're there to drop a rope down into the cage to help you the rest of the way out, if you do the first part. So that's moksha. That's remote viewing work that's describing the freedom from the cycle of reincarnation, contextual information about why it's occurring, how it's occurring, and who's doing this. And I think it gives a little bit of perspective that there's a much larger game that's being played here, and Earth is just one tiny part of it. And we're not the center of the universe. We're just one tiny aspect on a very large board that seems to go back and be funneling into a system of fight, if you will, on a cosmic scale of the fight between good and evil. And our pocket of the universe is one that appears to be controlled by the negative side. Its authority, it has its system, exerts power and control over this specific pocket in a way that keeps people entrapped here, enslaved here. And so these ideas that you may have read about in the past of prison planet seem to fit, is that it fits now the reasons for it don't seem to match up a lot of the other things that I've read about why this has occurred, or who's doing it. The remote viewing data very clearly kind of points to that idea that souls become entrapped here, and then they are harvested here again and again like bees for honey. And until the individual figures out how to escape the system, which the out-of-body experience, being able to determine where you exit from after death, is a key role. And then also overcoming the fear of exiting, it seems to be a key role. And then looking for that rope that's dropped down for you, and really using a discerning eye, I think, in that state of life after death, that soul state afterwards, seems to be important as well.